March 1993. A single storm produced blizzards, tornadoes, and hurricane-force winds across 26 states in 72 hours. It killed more than 300 people. They called it the storm of the century. It was not supposed to have a sequel. Right now, 740 National Weather Service alerts are firing across the United States at the same time, and the map they're painting does not look like 93. It looks like something that doesn't have a name yet, categories of hazard that have never shared the same system before, on a scale that is making forecasters reach for the word they almost never use. And the part that should concern you is not what's on the map tonight. It's what this pattern is assembling for Monday. If this has you hooked, subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this storm has more chapters coming, and we will be here for every single one. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are right now, and give me your honest read. Is the atmosphere leaving us a note we keep choosing not to read? Let's find out together. Part 1. The map that shouldn't exist. Something is wrong with the weather map. Not wrong in the way a forecast gets it wrong. Not a misplaced rain band or an overestimated snowfall total. Wrong in a deeper, more unsettling sense. Wrong in the way that makes professional meteorologists, people who have spent decades staring at atmospheric data, go quiet for a moment before they speak. Pull up the National Weather Service alert map for the United States right now. Go ahead, take a look at it. What you will see should not exist. Not in March, not on a single map, not at the same time. On the left side of the country, extreme heat watches are firing. Phoenix is staring down temperatures that belong in June, not the middle of the third month of the year. Triple digits in March. Meanwhile, on that same map, blizzard warnings are active across the northern plains. Actual blizzard warnings, with whiteout conditions and feet of snow and winds that can kill you if you're caught outside. And somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, tornado threats are being flagged after dark, which, as you will soon understand, is one of the most dangerous things that sentence can contain. Fire weather warnings are spreading across regions already dry and desperate. Hurricane-force wind gusts are being reported inland, far from any ocean. 740 National Weather Service alerts, active, simultaneously. 45 blizzard warnings on the same day that heat watches are in effect 2 time zones west. This is not a weather event. This is a weather argument that has turned into a weather war. The sheer volume of these alerts is not normal. Meteorologists track these numbers the way doctors track vital signs, and right now, the patient's vitals are alarming. On a typical March day, the country might see a few dozen watches and warnings spread across a region or two. What is happening right now is different by an order of magnitude. The National Weather Service does not issue 740 alerts casually. These things require human review, modelling confirmation, and genuine forecaster concern. The fact that this many are active simultaneously tells you something important. The atmosphere is not just acting up in one place, it is acting up everywhere at once. What makes this genuinely unusual is not any single hazard. Blizzards happen, tornadoes happen, heat waves happen, fire weather happens. These are not exotic events in isolation. What makes this map shocking to people who study weather for a living is that all of these hazard types have converged on the same national moment, powered by the same underlying system. That is the part that does not fit the pattern. That is the part that makes experienced forecasters use words like unprecedented and historic with unusual frequency this week. The geographic reach of this thing is staggering. We're talking about weather impacts from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic seaboard, from the Canadian border down to the Gulf states. The western United States is baking. The northern tier is being buried. The central corridor is being torn apart by winds and rotation. The southern states are watching fire danger climb. Potentially tens of millions of Americans are waking up today to a different version of this same catastrophic story, each one thinking their local crisis is the main event, not realizing they're all characters in the same chapter. Modern communication makes this stranger, not clearer. Your cousin in Minnesota is posting about the blizzard. Your friend in Phoenix is complaining about the heat. Someone you went to college with in Tennessee is sharing a tornado warning notification. And all of you are right. The weather is doing all of those things simultaneously. The atmosphere has decided that March 15th, 2026, is the day it will test every emergency management system in the country at once. That seems almost personal if you think about it too long. There is a question underneath all of this that we need to sit with for a moment before we go any further. The question is not just what is happening, though that is genuinely alarming. The question is how. How does an atmosphere produce this? What kind of configuration, what kind of pressure architecture, what kind of thermal conflict has to exist to generate blizzards and heat waves and tornadoes and fire weather all at once? Because here is what you need to understand before we go deeper. This storm is not a random event that got unlucky. It is not a coincidence. There is a mechanism behind it. There is a reason this map looks the way it looks today, and that reason tells us something uncomfortable about what the atmosphere is capable of, and possibly about what it is becoming. The map that should not exist is right there in front of you. The only question now is what created it. Part 2. The bomb cyclone over land. There is a technical term for what is happening over the centre of the United States right now, and it sounds dramatic because it is dramatic. The term is bombogenesis, a bomb cyclone. And no, the meteorologists did not name it that to get clicks. They named it that because a storm system that drops 24 millibars of pressure in 24 hours behaves, in atmospheric terms, like a detonation. Pressure is the measure of how hard the atmosphere is pushing down. When it drops that fast, the air around it rushes inward with violent urgency, the same way water rushes toward a drain. Winds accelerate. The storm intensifies in a feedback loop that can be almost explosive in its speed. You go from developing system to major storm faster than models sometimes anticipate. Here is the problem. Bomb cyclones are supposed to happen over oceans. Specifically, they form over the warm waters of the North Atlantic and North Pacific, where the combination of heat and moisture gives the atmosphere the fuel it needs for rapid intensification. The energy transaction that drives bombogenesis typically requires that warm ocean surface releasing heat and water vapor into the lower atmosphere. The classic bomb cyclone slams New England from offshore. It deepens over the Gulf Stream. It borrows energy from the sea. What is happening right now is happening over Kansas, over Nebraska, over the central continental interior of North America, which is about as far from a warm ocean as you can get on this planet, and it is deepening rapidly anyway. That is the anomaly that has meteorologists paying unusually close attention. The rulebook says this should not work this well, this far inland. The storm did not read the rulebook, so what is fueling it? The answer requires you to think about temperature not as a number on a thermometer, but as a form of stored energy. When you place extreme cold directly adjacent to extreme heat, and we are talking about temperature differences across a horizontal distance that are genuinely remarkable, cold air masses in the -teens Fahrenheit, meeting air masses in the 80s and 90s, you have created something the atmosphere needs to resolve. Nature abhors a thermal imbalance the way it abhors a vacuum. The zone between these two air masses becomes a battleground, and the storm is the mechanism through which the atmosphere tries to even things out. This is the continental temperature contrast engine. Instead of warm ocean water feeding the cyclone from below, this storm is being powered laterally by the collision of two enormous air masses that have no business being this close to each other at this time of year. The pressure gradient deepens. The storm feeds on the conflict rather than the warmth. The result is a bomb cyclone that forms right over the middle of the country and intensifies with alarming speed. There is also another ingredient in this recipe that we should not overlook, which is the polar vortex. The polar vortex is not a storm itself. It is a large-scale circulation of cold air around the North Pole, held in place by atmospheric dynamics that usually keep the coldest air locked up north of Canada. When it weakens or becomes distorted, fragments of that Arctic air spill southward, like water pouring through a crack in a dam. That is part of what is happening right now. Cold Arctic air is not just drifting south. It is being accelerated south, adding energy to the developing low and intensifying the temperature contrast that is driving the whole system. Meteorologists tracking this event have noted how unusually deep and fast the intensification has been. The word remarkable keeps appearing in their statements. The pressure falls have exceeded some model guidance. That last part matters. When the storm behaves more intensely than the computer models predicted, it means the models did not fully capture something about the atmospheric setup. There is energy in this system that the standard frameworks underestimated. Here is a question worth asking quietly. Is this a freak event? A once-in-a-generation alignment of conditions that happens to be occurring right now? Or is something in the background changing? The rules of the game shifting in ways that make inland bomb cyclones more likely, more intense, more common? The scientists do not have a consensus answer yet, but they are asking the question, and the fact that they are asking it should tell you something. The last time something approaching this occurred over the central interior, it made history. This one may too, and it has not finished deepening yet. Part 3. The temperature war driving the storm. Imagine two armies camped on opposite ends of a continent, each one enormous, each one extreme, and the border between them stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border like a scar across the map. On the western side, a heat dome has settled over the American Southwest, with the kind of arrogance that belongs to July, not March. Phoenix is looking at temperatures approaching and exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. 100 degrees in the third week of March. Meteorologists tracking the earliest 100-degree readings in recorded history for that region are already flagging this as historically anomalous. This is not a warm spell. This is a heat event that has no precedent for its timing. The air over the desert southwest is expanding, rising, and building a ridge of high pressure that acts like a wall. A warm, heavy, immovable wall that is forcing everything that approaches it to go around or go through. On the eastern side, an Arctic air mass is doing the opposite of everything the heat dome is doing. Temperatures across portions of the upper Midwest and Great Lakes region are running 20, 25, even 30 degrees below their seasonal averages. The ground is frozen. The wind is vicious. This is not just cold for March. This is cold that belongs in January, plunging into geography that has already started its spring thaw, creating a shock to the system that the atmosphere has to respond to. Now hold both of those images in your mind at the same time. 100 degrees in Phoenix and temperatures 25 below normal in Minnesota. Both happening right now, both on the same continent separated by roughly 1,500 miles. That gap, that thermal abyss between the two air masses, is where this storm is being born and where it is drawing its energy. Think of the atmosphere like a stretched rubber band. The further you pull it in two directions, the more energy is stored in the tension. When the band finally snaps, it does not snap gently. The energy releases all at once, in all directions. What we are watching right now is the atmospheric equivalent of that snap, except instead of a rubber band, it is a continental air mass collision spanning thousands of miles, and instead of a simple snap, the release takes the form of blizzards and tornadoes and fire weather and hurricane-force winds. The jet stream is the mechanism through which this tension expresses itself. The jet stream is not a fixed channel in the sky. It is a fast-moving river of air at high altitudes, and its position and shape are determined largely by the temperature difference between the tropics and the poles. When that difference is large and sharp, the jet stream runs fast and relatively straight. When extreme contrasts like the ones we are seeing right now push against it from both sides, the jet stream buckles. It develops enormous waves. Meteorologists call them Rossby waves, which sounds academic but describes something genuinely consequential. These waves slow down, they amplify. The troughs and ridges that develop become more extreme. Storm systems trapped in these patterns intensify and linger, rather than moving through quickly. Here is where the speculation becomes important, and I want to be precise about this because the science matters. Some atmospheric researchers have proposed that the warming of the Arctic, which is happening roughly 4 times faster than the global average, is changing the behavior of the jet stream in exactly this way. As the temperature contrast between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes decreases, the theory goes, the jet stream weakens and becomes more wavy, more prone to these extreme amplified patterns. Other researchers push back on this hypothesis and point to natural variability cycles as sufficient explanation. The honest answer is that the scientific community is still working through this actively. What is not in dispute is that the temperature contrast driving this particular storm is extraordinary for March. The seasonal context matters here too. March is the hinge month of the year, the month when winter and spring fight for control. Cold and warm air masses do battle every March, but this year, both sides of that battle have been supercharged. The warm side is historically warm, the cold side is historically cold, the contrast is historically sharp, and the storm emerging from that contrast is historically intense. The temperature war does not care about your plans for the week. Part 4. The 3 storms inside one storm. What if I told you that what the news is calling a major storm system is actually 3 separate, fully realized weather disasters, all wearing the same coat? Because that is what this is. The single low-pressure system currently spinning over the central United States is generating 3 distinct catastrophic weather events simultaneously, each one capable of killing people, destroying infrastructure, and making headlines on its own. They share a parent. They share a pressure field. But for the people living inside each of them, the experience is entirely different. Start in the north. Across the northern plains, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and into the Great Lakes region, what is falling from the sky is not rain, and it is not a light dusting of late-season snow. This is a legitimate blizzard. Wind gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour are creating ground blizzard conditions, which means even where snow is not actively falling, the snow already on the ground is being picked up and thrown horizontally with enough force to reduce visibility to near zero. Whiteout. Not figuratively. Literally, you cannot see the hood of your own car. Roads are becoming impassable within minutes of being ploughed. Drifts are forming faster than equipment can clear them. The combination of heavy snowfall totals measured in feet in some locations, combined with sustained high winds, is the kind of winter event that shuts regions down entirely and can strand motorists fatally if they're caught in the wrong place. Now move south to the Central Corridor. From the Mississippi Valley eastward through the Ohio Valley and into the Mid-South, the atmosphere is generating the conditions for a significant tornado outbreak. Warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico is streaming northward and running underneath cold, dry air aloft, creating the unstable, rotating atmospheric conditions that spawn tornadoes. The Storm Prediction Center has issued elevated severe weather outlooks for this region. And the timing is the part of this that should make you genuinely uneasy. This is a nighttime event. The most dangerous tornadoes in the tornado threat area are expected after sunset, potentially in the middle of the night, when the majority of people in their path are asleep. Nighttime tornadoes are not stronger than daytime ones, but they are dramatically deadlier, and we will come back to exactly why in a later part of this story. Then there is a third storm entirely, one that does not look like either of the other two. Move to the southern plains and parts of the southwest, where the same wind field driving the blizzard in the north and the tornadoes in the centre is arriving in a region that is hot, dry, and has been dry for weeks. Relative humidity is dropping to single digits in some locations, winds at 30, 40, 50 miles per hour, vegetation that is desiccated and ready to burn, fire weather watch conditions. A single spark in those conditions can produce a wildfire that moves faster than a person can run. We have the same storm, the same pressure system, the same wind field, and in the north it is burying people in snow, while in the south it is generating wildfire risk. That is not a contradiction. That is a demonstration of how a single atmospheric engine can produce radically different outcomes depending on the local conditions it encounters. 3 disasters, 1 system, happening right now, to real people in real places. Historical context matters here. Multi-hazard events with this level of simultaneous diversity are genuinely rare. You can find precedents for individual components. Big blizzards, yes. Significant tornado outbreaks, yes. Serious fire weather events, yes. Finding all 3 generated by the same system in the same 24 to 48 hour window is the kind of thing that generates papers in meteorological journals. Forecasters remember events like this the way doctors remember unusual cases. They reference them in future briefings. They use them as calibration points. The question hanging over all 3 of these events is one we have not fully answered yet. What set the atmosphere up to generate something this complex, this simultaneously diverse in its destruction? The storm inside the storm inside the storm did not assemble itself arbitrarily. Something larger built the stage for this. Part 5. Monday. The second wave. You might be tempted, after digesting everything in the previous section, to think the worst is behind us once tonight passes. That would be a reasonable thought. It would also be wrong. Meteorologists have been unusually direct in their messaging this week, and directness in the forecasting community is itself a signal worth paying attention to. These are scientists trained to communicate uncertainty, to hedge their language, to say there is a chance and potential exists for. When they start using phrases like, "this could be worse than tonight," and "prepare now," they are making a deliberate choice to set aside the hedging in favour of clarity. That choice tells you something. Monday's threat centres on the East Coast corridor, specifically the zone from Pennsylvania southward through Virginia, the Carolinas, and potentially further into the mid-Atlantic population centres. And the concern is not just that severe weather will happen there. The concern is the type of severe weather and where it is happening. The Storm Prediction Center issued a moderate risk, a level 4 on the 1 to 5 scale, for portions of this region. A moderate risk historically is a relatively rare designation, used when the atmospheric ingredients for a significant outbreak are well established and forecaster confidence is high. It is not the highest level, but it is the level at which emergency managers start making specific preparations rather than monitoring. The particular threat on Monday involves the storm's trajectory intersecting with the population density of the eastern seaboard. This is not a wide-open Great Plains situation where a tornado can touch down and travel for miles through farmland. The areas under threat on Monday include suburbs, cities, infrastructure corridors, places where the human cost of a direct impact is higher by orders of magnitude simply because more people live there. A tornado that would cause limited casualties in a rural area becomes a mass casualty event in a suburban neighbourhood. The wind threat on Monday is also significant independent of tornadoes. Damaging straight-line wind events, the kind that knock down trees onto houses and power lines, that flip vehicles on highways, that take roofs off structures, these are being forecasted for a broad area. Widespread power outages in mid-March, when temperatures behind the storm will be cold, carry their own set of cascading consequences. Vulnerable populations, the elderly, those without backup heat, those with medical dependencies on electricity, face elevated risk even from events that do not technically rise to the level of disaster in their headline violence. There is an uncertainty note that honest communication requires here. Forecast models have been evolving rapidly on this event, as they often do with complex multi-phase systems. The specifics of Monday's setup could shift. The threat area might expand or contract. The type of severe weather most likely might be revised as new data arrives. This is not a reason for complacency. It is a reason for continued vigilance, and a reminder that the atmosphere operates on its own timeline, not ours. What we know with confidence is that this system is not done. The first act, tonight's blizzard, tornado, and fire weather event, is severe. The second act, arriving with Monday, could concentrate its energy on population centres in ways that the first act does not, and the whole performance is powered by an atmospheric configuration that we have not fully explained yet. Why is the jet stream positioned the way it is right now? Why did this particular winter create the conditions for this kind of spring explosion? And what does it tell us about the atmosphere's future behaviour? Part 6. The jet stream is warping. There is a river in the sky that most people have heard of but few people have thought about carefully. And right now that river is behaving in a way that is making atmospheric scientists deeply uncomfortable. Not the performative discomfort of researchers who enjoy dramatic language. The quiet, measured discomfort of people who have spent careers studying a system they thought they understood reasonably well, and who are looking at the current atmospheric configuration with the specific expression of someone who recognizes the pattern but not the intensity, like hearing a familiar piece of music played at a volume the instrument was not supposed to reach. The notes are right, the volume is wrong, and the question of why the volume is wrong is one that the scientific community is actively, urgently, and with genuine uncertainty working to answer. The jet stream is a band of fast-moving air circling the northern hemisphere at altitudes between 20,000 and 40,000 feet, embedded in the upper troposphere at the boundary between the lower atmosphere where weather happens and the stratosphere above it. Its average wind speeds run between 100 and 200 miles per hour, though in strongly amplified patterns the core winds can exceed those averages significantly. It is not a fixed feature of the atmosphere. It migrates north and south with the seasons, generally tracking further north in summer as the hemisphere warms and further south in winter as the hemisphere cools, and it constantly bends and buckles in response to the temperature contrasts and pressure patterns operating in the atmosphere below and around it. Think of it as a river with a variable channel, one that shifts its course continuously in response to the landscape it is moving through, except that the landscape in this case is itself made of temperature gradients and pressure systems that are also moving and changing. The jet stream is not, strictly speaking, a cause of weather. This is a common misconception worth correcting directly. The jet stream does not create storms, it steers them. It is the atmospheric infrastructure along which weather systems travel, the current that determines how fast a storm moves from one place to another, how long it lingers over a given region, and how much energy it can accumulate from the temperature contrasts in the air masses on either side of it. A storm system sitting directly beneath a strong, fast-moving jet stream segment will be pushed along quickly, affecting any given location for a relatively short period. A storm system sitting beneath a slow, amplified jet stream segment will stall, deepen, and linger, sometimes affecting the same region with the same hazardous conditions for days rather than hours. The difference between a 2-day inconvenience and a multi-day disaster is often not the storm itself. It is what the jet stream is doing above it. Right now, the jet stream over North America is doing something that atmospheric scientists describe with the specific technical term highly amplified, and the translation of that term into plain language requires a brief detour into geometry. Under normal or moderately active conditions, the jet stream flows from west to east in a wave pattern with relatively modest north-south swings. The waves are present because the jet stream always waves, but they are moderate in amplitude, and the overall flow retains a predominantly westerly character. Under highly amplified conditions, the waves become enormous. The jet stream dives far to the south over one part of the continent, creating what meteorologists call a trough, a southward plunging excursion of cold upper-level air. Then it swings far to the north over another part of the continent, creating a ridge, a northward soaring excursion of warm upper-level air. The troughs and ridges of a highly amplified jet stream are not subtle features on a weather map. They are dramatic, continent-spanning structures that look, on satellite imagery and upper-level analysis charts, like the atmosphere has been pulled apart and stretched in opposite directions simultaneously. The current configuration is about as amplified as jet stream patterns get over North America. The ridge is sitting over the southwest, and it is not a modest ridge. It is a towering, reinforced record-intensity ridge that has been trapping the heat dome responsible for Phoenix approaching triple digits in March, for the earliest 100-degree temperature readings in the historical record for the region, for the kind of heat that belongs in June arriving in the third week of the third month. The trough is sitting over the eastern half of the continent, and it is not a modest trough either. It is plunging southward with enough depth and energy to drag genuine Arctic air masses into regions that should be well past their coldest winter temperatures, generating the anomalously cold conditions that are providing the cold side of the temperature contrast powering the entire storm system. The storm we have been discussing throughout this entire story is sitting precisely at the most energetic location in this pattern, in the zone between the ridge and the trough, at the point where the jet stream transitions from northward to southward, where wind shear is maximized and where upper-level divergence is pulling air upward from the surface and creating the low pressure that is deepening into the bomb cyclone discussed earlier. Here is the feature of highly amplified jet stream patterns that makes them disproportionately dangerous compared to their intensity alone. When the jet stream makes these large swings, storm systems travelling along it slow down dramatically. The physics behind this is related to the way wave energy propagates in the atmosphere. Large amplitude waves in the jet stream are associated with slower eastward propagation of the weather systems embedded in them. A storm system riding a fast zonal jet stream might cross the continent in 2 to 3 days, affecting any given location for a limited window before moving on. A storm system embedded in a highly amplified, slow-moving jet stream pattern can stall nearly in place or move so slowly that its effects are sustained over the same geographic area for days. Hazard dwell time increases. The cumulative impact of sustained blizzard conditions, sustained fire weather, sustained tornado threat compounds in ways that a faster-moving system of equivalent instantaneous intensity would not produce. The storm is not just strong, it is slow, and slow is often more dangerous than strong. The question of why the jet stream has arrived at this particular configuration, at this particular time of year, is where the science becomes genuinely interesting and, in the most intellectually honest terms available, genuinely contested. One explanatory framework, supported by a substantial and growing body of research from institutions including the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Alfred Wegener Institute, Rutgers University and others, invokes the concept of Arctic amplification. The argument in its essential form proceeds as follows. The Arctic is warming at roughly 3 to 4 times the rate of the global average, driven by the sea ice feedbacks and atmospheric dynamics discussed in the climate section of this story. As the Arctic warms faster than the mid-latitudes, the temperature contrast between high latitudes and mid-latitudes, the fundamental driver of the jet stream's strength, decreases. A weaker temperature gradient produces a weaker, slower jet stream. a weaker, slower jet stream is more susceptible to developing large amplitude waves and to holding those waves in place for extended periods, rather than propagating them eastward efficiently. Under this framework, the highly amplified pattern producing this week's storm is not just a weather event. It is a symptom of a structural change in the atmospheric circulation that is being driven by the Arctic's accelerated warming. The counter-argument is also supported by legitimate peer-reviewed atmospheric research and deserves equal presentation because scientific integrity requires it. Natural variability in the climate system, specifically the multi-decadal oscillation patterns in Pacific and Atlantic sea surface temperatures, the El Niño and La Niña cycle, and the internal variability of the stratospheric polar vortex can produce highly amplified jet stream patterns without any long-term trend component. Some researchers argue that the apparent increase in jet stream amplification in recent decades falls within the range of natural variability and does not require a climate change explanation. The Pacific decadal oscillation, which operates on timescales of 20 to 30 years, can drive prolonged periods of amplified jet stream behavior over North America that resemble what we are currently observing. Attributing the current pattern specifically to Arctic amplification rather than to natural variability cycles requires a statistical confidence that the current length of the observational record does not yet provide. The scientific community is working through this disagreement actively, with genuine data on both sides and genuine uncertainty about how to weight the competing explanations. What is not contested, and what the historical jet stream analysis record supports with reasonable consistency, is that the frequency and magnitude of highly amplified patterns over North America appears to have increased over the past several decades when viewed across the full dataset. Whether that trend represents the early signal of a structurally changing circulation, a run of natural variability that will eventually revert, or some combination of both, that question remains open. The atmosphere does not organise itself around what is politically convenient to believe, and it does not pause its behaviour while scientists reach consensus on its causes. The practical consequence of the current warped jet stream is precisely what the people living beneath it are experiencing right now, a storm system that is anomalously intense by the standards of mid-March, anomalously slow-moving by the standards of any season, and simultaneously generating every major weather hazard type across a continent that stretches 3,000 miles from coast to coast. Every weather balloon ascent, every aircraft reconnaissance flight, every satellite pass confirming the upper-level wind field is adding to a picture that has remained consistent for days. The pattern supporting this system is not breaking down, it is holding, and it will hold until the atmospheric dynamics that created it finally shift on the atmosphere's schedule, not ours. Which raises the question that the jet stream's behaviour this week makes almost impossible to avoid. Is the river in the sky warping because of what happened in the months that preceded this storm? Because if the answer to that question is yes, if the winter laid the foundation for the jet stream configuration that is now producing this event, then what happened this winter was not simply unusual seasonal weather, it was a setup, a slow, quiet, incremental preparation for exactly this moment. And the atmosphere was patient enough to wait until all the pieces were in place before it showed anyone what it had been building. Part 7. The winter that broke the pattern. The storm over the United States right now did not arrive without preparation. The atmosphere spent the better part of 5 months building the conditions for this moment, and most people were not watching closely enough to see it happening, not because the signals were absent, but because they arrived quietly, incrementally, in the kind of slow accumulation that does not generate headlines until the bill comes due all at once. This is one of the more disorienting things about extreme weather events at the scale of what we are currently witnessing. The public experience of a major storm is almost always sudden. The warnings arrive a few days in advance. The event itself unfolds over hours to days, and then it passes, and the atmosphere returns to something that looks normal, and the event recedes into memory as a discrete occurrence, a thing that happened, with a beginning and an end separate from what came before and after. That framing is emotionally natural and practically convenient. It is also, from an atmospheric science perspective, almost entirely wrong. Major weather events do not emerge from neutral backgrounds. They are the culmination of set-up processes that can run for weeks, months, and in some cases seasons, slow-building imbalances in the atmospheric system that accumulate until the conditions for release are finally met. at which point the release is dramatic and the people experiencing it have no idea how long it was in preparation. The winter of 2025 into 2026 across the western United States was not a normal winter, and the abnormality was the kind that does not announce itself clearly while it is happening. Snow cover in portions of the Sierra Nevada and Rocky Mountain ranges came in uneven. Some elevation bands, particularly the higher ones, saw near normal or above normal snowpack accumulation, while lower elevations ran dramatically dry in ways that affected water resource planning, wildfire risk assessments, and the thermal properties of the western land surface entering spring. But the more atmospherically significant anomaly was not the snow, it was the temperature. Western states, particularly the southwest corridor from Nevada through Arizona and into California's interior, experienced a winter that ran consistently above seasonal averages month after month. Not dramatically above in any single week. Not the kind of warmth that generates breathless television coverage or sets single-day records that make the news. The kind of warmth that accumulates in the background, that makes February feel like early April, that leaves the soil warmer than it should be, and the atmosphere above it carrying more energy than the calendar date would lead you to expect. The kind of winter that makes you say, sometime in late February, that it has not really felt like winter, and then immediately forget you said it, because no individual day gave you a reason to remember. That forgettable, cumulative warmth was doing something important that almost no one was narrating in real time. Warm western winters alter the moisture profiles of the lower atmosphere in ways that matter for spring storm potential. They reduce the surface level temperature contrast that helps anchor certain storm tracks in their typical positions, making the atmosphere more susceptible to the kind of dramatic pattern shifts that produce anomalous storm configurations. They warm the land surface itself, the actual soil, the actual rock, the actual desert floor, which means that the air sitting above that surface arrives at spring preheated, already carrying more sensible heat energy than it would in a year following a cold, well-insulated winter. When cold air eventually moves over a preheated western land surface, the instability potential is higher. The atmosphere reacts more violently to the same forcing. The warm western winter, in other words, did not merely disappoint skiers and worry water managers. It loaded a spring that was always going to be energetic with additional potential energy that had nowhere to go but into the first major pattern change of the season. The Pacific Ocean deserves its own paragraph in this story, because it is never a passive backdrop to North American weather, and this winter it has been an active and consequential participant. Sea surface temperature anomalies in the Pacific Ocean, the specific geographic distribution of warmer and cooler patches across the basin, play an outsized role in determining the atmospheric pressure patterns that govern weather across the North American continent on timescales of weeks to months. The ocean communicates with the atmosphere through heat and moisture exchange at the surface, and those communications propagate into the upper atmosphere as changes in the ridge and trough pattern of the jet stream. The arrangement of Pacific temperature anomalies that developed over the course of this winter has been consistently supportive of a high-pressure ridge over the western continent, a persistent tendency for the atmosphere to build a warm, blocking ridge over the west that resists the passage of storms and traps heat at the surface. That ridge tendency, operating at modest intensity through much of the winter, is exactly the pattern that has now been amplified and supercharged into the record heat dome currently baking the southwest. The fingerprint of the Pacific's winter behavior is not a metaphor. It is physically present in the current atmospheric configuration, encoded in the pressure fields and temperature gradients that are driving this storm. The ocean spent months writing a message in the atmosphere. This week, the atmosphere is delivering it. Historical analogues for this type of winter to spring setup exist, and they are instructive without being perfectly predictive. The spring of 2012, which produced one of the most remarkable early season severe weather outbreaks in the modern record, followed a winter across the central and southern United States that was characterized by persistent warmth and a highly amplified jet stream pattern with recognizable similarities to the current configuration. The spring of 1973, which produced catastrophic flooding across the Mississippi River system alongside explosive severe weather, followed a winter with unusual Pacific forcing patterns that preconditioned the atmosphere for volatile spring behavior. The spring of 1992 had elements of the same setup in the West. None of these analogues maps perfectly onto the current situation. Every atmospheric configuration is unique in its precise combination of variables, and the background climate state has shifted enough since 1973 that direct comparisons require careful qualification. But the general principle that emerges consistently from these historical cases is not subtle. Mild, warm western winters do not produce benign springs. They produce springs that are looking for a fight, and they tend to find one as soon as the first significant cold air mass pushes south from Canada and meets the pre-energized warm air waiting for it. The Rocky Mountain snowpack contributes a separate but mechanistically connected piece to this story. In a winter with robust deep snow cover across the high elevations of the Sierra Nevada, the Rockies, and the intermountain ranges, the mountains function as a thermal moderator for the western atmosphere. The snowpack absorbs solar radiation through the melt process rather than allowing it to heat the land surface, keeping the western air mass cooler and less energetically charged into late spring. It moderates the temperature contrast between the western and eastern halves of the continent by keeping the west cooler than it would otherwise be, which in turn keeps the jet stream in a more moderate, less amplified configuration. A winter that delivers uneven snowpack, with lower elevations dry and higher elevations near normal, removes a significant fraction of that moderating influence. The western land surface heats faster in March and April. The temperature contrast between the warming west and any Arctic air mass pushing south into the east becomes sharper. The jet stream has more thermal contrast to work with when it finally begins its spring reorganization, and more thermal contrast means more energy available for the amplification that produces the kind of extreme ridge-trough pattern currently visible on every atmospheric analysis chart. Combine all of these ingredients and what you have is not a storm that appeared from nowhere. You have a storm that was being assembled component by component through 5 months of atmospheric preconditioning. The Pacific temperature anomalies set the ridge tendency. The warm winter surface temperatures loaded the instability potential. The uneven snowpack removed the moderating influence of the mountain thermal sink. The early arrival of the record heat dome supercharged the ridge that the Pacific had been building all winter. And then finally an Arctic air mass pushed south from Canada, found a pre-energized atmosphere with extreme thermal contrast already established, and triggered the release of everything the winter had been quietly storing. The atmosphere filed its intentions in small increments through every above-average temperature reading from October through February, through every week of below-normal snowpack at lower elevations, through every month of Pacific sea surface temperature anomalies that nudged the ridge pattern slightly further toward amplification. The signals were there. They were real. They were being measured and recorded by the observational networks that blanket the hemisphere. We just were not reading them as a single sentence until the sentence ended with an exclamation point shaped like a bomb cyclone over Kansas. This is the thing about the atmosphere that makes it simultaneously fascinating and humbling. It is always writing the next event while the current one is still unfolding. Right now, while this storm tears across the continent, the ocean is already composing the next chapter. The question is whether we are paying attention early enough in the writing to understand what is coming before it arrives. And embedded in this storm's final act, arriving with the darkness, is one of the least understood and most dangerous elements of the entire event, the part that kills people, not because it is the strongest, but because it is the one they never see coming. Part 8. The Night Tornado Problem. There is a particular kind of fear that weather forecasters carry with them on nights like this one, and it is not the fear of being wrong, it is the fear of being right. Being wrong in weather forecasting carries professional consequences. A missed event, a poorly worded warning, a forecast that sent people scrambling unnecessarily. Those consequences are real, and forecasters take them seriously. But being right about a nighttime tornado outbreak carries a different weight entirely. Being right means that somewhere in the next several hours, in the darkness over the Mississippi Valley or the Ohio Valley or the Mid-South, the atmosphere is going to do exactly what the model said it would do, and exactly what the briefings warned it might do. And the question of whether the people in its path survive that accuracy will depend on factors that have nothing to do with the quality of the forecast. It will depend on whether they are awake, whether their phone is charged, whether they live in a structure that can withstand what is coming, whether they have somewhere to go that is lower and more interior than where they are sleeping right now. The forecast can be perfect and people can still die, and the forecasters who issued the perfect warning will spend the aftermath knowing that. That is the specific fear that occupies the people running models and writing public statements at 2 a.m. on a night like this one. Not the fear of professional failure, the fear of professional success that is not enough. Tornadoes at night kill, at rates that daytime tornadoes simply do not match, and this disparity is one of the most important and least publicly understood facts in severe weather meteorology. It is not because nighttime tornadoes are physically different from daytime ones in any meaningful atmospheric sense. The dynamics that produce them are identical. The thermodynamic instability, the wind shear profile, the mesocyclone rotation, the pressure drop at the center of a violent vortex, none of these physical characteristics change based on whether the sun is above or below the horizon. A 200-mile-per-hour wind at 3 in the morning exerts exactly the same force as a 200-mile-per-hour wind at 3 in the afternoon. The tornado itself does not know what time it is. What changes entirely is everything that determines whether a human being in the path of that tornado survives it. And the list of things that change is long enough and significant enough that the difference in survival outcomes between day and night tornado events is not marginal. It is substantial, and it is consistent across the historical record. During daylight hours, a tornado is visible. This fact is so obvious that it can seem trivial until you think carefully about what visibility actually provides. A visible tornado is a warning system that operates independently of any official alert infrastructure. Storm chasers positioned in the storm's vicinity can see the funnel and report it in real time, providing ground truth that supplements radar-based detection. Ordinary people outside, farmers, truck drivers, people walking to their cars can see the rotation, hear the distinctive roar that survivors consistently describe as resembling a freight train or a jet engine at close range, and make an immediate decision to seek shelter without waiting for a siren or a phone alert. The visual margin of safety is not captured in any official lead time statistic because it operates outside the official warning system. It exists in the gap between when a tornado forms and when a National Weather Service warning is issued, and during daylight hours that gap is partially filled by human observers whose eyes work. In some documented cases, community members saw rotation and warned their neighbours minutes before any official alert was issued. Those minutes matter. In tornado survival, minutes are the currency of a life. At night, that currency disappears. The funnel cloud is invisible against a dark sky. The rotation is invisible. The debris field, the swirling mass of material that a tornado lofts into the air, and that can sometimes be seen even when the funnel itself is obscured by rain, is invisible until the rotating mass is close enough that visibility is irrelevant because there is no longer time to act on what you are seeing. The only warnings available at night come from radar, and radar, for all its genuine capability, has structural limitations that become critically important in exactly the scenarios most likely to occur tonight. Doppler radar is a remarkable technology. The network of 159 WSR-88D radars operated by the National Weather Service across the United States represents one of the most sophisticated ground-based atmospheric observation systems ever built, and it has saved an enormous number of lives since its deployment through the 1990s, transformed the timeliness and accuracy of severe weather warnings. But Doppler radar operates on a scanning cycle. The antenna rotates, collecting data at multiple elevation angles in sequence, completing a full volume scan in approximately 4 to 6 minutes under standard operational settings, and approximately 1 minute under the rapid scan supplemental mode that forecasters activate during active severe weather. 1 minute to 4 to 6 minutes between complete updates of the three-dimensional wind field inside a storm. In a fast-moving, rapidly evolving convective system, that gap is long enough for a tornado to form, touch down, travel a significant distance, and dissipate before the next radar scan confirms what happened. The National Weather Service issues tornado warnings with an average lead time of approximately 13 minutes, based on Storm Prediction Center analysis of historical warning performance. 13 minutes is the average across all tornado types and all times of day. For the specific type of tornado most likely to occur tonight, that average is not the relevant number. The tornado threat embedded in tonight's storm system is not primarily from the classic isolated supercell thunderstorm, the photogenic, well-organized rotating storm that produces the visually dramatic wedge tornadoes that appear in documentary footage and that generate the most extensive and detectable radar signatures. Supercell tornadoes are dangerous and can be catastrophic, but they are also, in relative terms, the tornadoes that the warning system handles best. They are large, they are persistent, they rotate for extended periods before producing a tornado, giving radar operators time to identify the mesocyclone and issue warnings with meaningful lead time. They move at speeds that, while fast, are generally trackable. The primary tornado threat tonight comes from a different animal entirely. Meteorologists call them quasi-linear convective system tornadoes, or QLCS tornadoes, and they are produced not by isolated rotating supercells, but by long lines of storms, squall lines, racing across the landscape at 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. These lines are the fast-moving, rain-heavy, wind-driven systems that announce themselves with a wall of darkness on the western horizon and arrive sounding like the sky is tearing. Within these lines, small but intense areas of rotation can develop with extraordinary speed. The transition from no detectable rotation to a brief, violent tornado touchdown can occur in 10 to 15 minutes or less, faster in some documented cases. The tornadoes produced are often on the ground for only a few minutes. They may travel only a mile or two. They are frequently embedded in rainfall heavy enough that even professional storm chasers positioned within visual range cannot see them, and they do not announce themselves with the extended visible wall cloud and rotating updraft that gives a supercell tornado its distinctive and somewhat cinematic warning signature. A QLCS tornado at 2 a.m, embedded in a squall line moving at 50 miles per hour, wrapped in heavy rain, producing no visible funnel, generating a radar rotation signature that may exist for only 1 or 2 scan cycles before the tornado dissipates. This is the scenario that produces the specific fear described at the beginning of this section. The forecast was right. The warning was issued, the siren went off, and the person who needed to hear it was asleep with their phone on silent in a bedroom at the back of a mobile home. The fatality statistics are consistent and unambiguous on this point. Analysis of Storm Prediction Center tornado fatality data and the broader peer-reviewed literature on tornado mortality shows that nighttime tornado events, particularly those embedded in fast-moving squall lines in the late night and early morning hours, produce fatality to tornado ratios dramatically higher than comparable daytime events. Studies examining this disparity have reported nighttime tornadoes as 2 to 3 times more lethal per storm than daytime tornadoes when controlling for tornado intensity, path length, and population exposure. The lethality is not in the tornado, it is in the darkness surrounding it and the sleep surrounding the people in its path. The protective measures that close this gap are neither expensive nor technically complicated, and this is perhaps the most important practical information in this entire story. A battery-powered weather radio set to alert for your specific county will sound an alarm when a tornado warning is issued regardless of whether your power is on or your phone is charged. A smartphone with wireless emergency alerts enabled will receive National Weather Service tornado warnings as loud, intrusive alerts designed to wake a sleeping person. Knowing in advance, before tonight, before the storm arrives, where the lowest, most interior room in your structure is located so that you're not making that decision in the 45 seconds between hearing an alert and needing to be in position. These 3 things, combined, represent the margin between the fatality statistics and the survival statistics for nighttime tornado events. The storm does not give partial credit for knowing about these preparations without having made them. The atmosphere grades on a binary scale. While the tornado threat unfolds in the darkness over the central corridor, and while people in the blizzard zone dig out and people in the fire weather zone watch the horizon, and people in the heat dome run air conditioning units that were not designed for March, something else entirely is happening in the sky above all of it. Something that, in any other week, in any news cycle not already saturated with atmospheric emergencies and asteroid flybys and solar storms, would itself be the most unusual and beautiful story anyone reported. And in its own quiet way, it is still both of those things. Part 9, Aurora in a blizzard. The sun is not behaving itself either. This is not a metaphor. While the largest continental storm system in recent memory is tearing across the United States, the sun has independently chosen this week to produce elevated geomagnetic activity from a coronal hole, a region of the sun's atmosphere where the magnetic field opens outward like a door left ajar, releasing a stream of solar wind particles directly into space and, in this case, directly at Earth. The resulting geomagnetic storm, rated G1 to G2 on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's 5-point scale, has been pushing auroral displays significantly southward from their usual polar haunts. The Northern Lights, which normally confine their performances to Alaska, northern Canada, and Scandinavia have been spotted this week over states that do not typically make it onto the aurora viewing map, which means that North Dakota, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, the same states currently being hammered by a historic blizzard, the same states where roads are closed and visibility has dropped to near zero, and snow is accumulating in feet rather than inches, people are reporting that on the rare moments when the cloud cover breaks between snow bands, there are auroras in the sky. Green and red curtains of light shimmering above the whiteout, ribbons of colour hanging in the darkness over a landscape that is simultaneously being buried under one of the most significant blizzards of the past decade. If that image does not strike you as simultaneously beautiful and slightly unreal, then I want you to sit with it for a moment longer, because it deserves the full weight of your attention. A blizzard and an aurora, happening in the same place, at the same time, witnessed by the same people who are also watching their driveways disappear and their power lines sway. The cosmos and the atmosphere staging their events in the same theatre on the same night, apparently without consulting each other on the scheduling. Let me explain what you are actually seeing when you see an aurora, because the mechanism is genuinely remarkable, and understanding it makes the spectacle more interesting rather than less. Auroras occur when charged particles from the Sun, primarily electrons and protons accelerated by the solar wind, travel the roughly 93 million miles between the Sun and Earth, and then get funneled by Earth's magnetic field toward the polar regions. When those particles collide with oxygen and nitrogen molecules in the upper atmosphere, they transfer energy to those molecules, exciting their electrons to higher energy states. When the electrons drop back down, they release that energy as light. The oxygen collisions produce the green and red colours that define the classic aurora display. Oxygen around 60 miles above the surface produces red, while oxygen at lower altitudes, around 60 to 150 miles up, produces the more common and vivid green. The nitrogen molecules contribute blues and purples, adding depth and variation to the display. The altitude, the density of the atmospheric layer, and the energy of the incoming particles all interact to produce the specific colours and movement patterns you see on a given night. The curtains and ribbons and pulses are not random. They are the direct visual expression of magnetic field geometry, meeting particle physics in the upper atmosphere. None of this is dangerous to people on the ground. A G1 or G2 geomagnetic storm is a relatively mild space weather event on a scale that runs to G5. We have been through far larger ones without catastrophe. The G5 event of May 2024, the strongest geomagnetic storm in roughly 2 decades, pushed auroras as far south as Florida and Texas and produced widespread social media documentation of a phenomenon that most people in the continental United States had never personally witnessed. It also caused some satellite orientation issues and minor GPS degradation. The world continued. The lights were, by most accounts, spectacular. What is interesting, and here I want to be careful to flag this as speculative, because the science on it is genuinely not settled, and I have no interest in presenting hypothesis as fact, is the question of whether elevated solar activity and geomagnetic conditions have any subtle interaction effects with extreme terrestrial weather events. The question sounds fringe, and in its more dramatic formulations it certainly lives in fringe territory. But there are credentialed researchers who have examined correlations between geomagnetic storm activity and atmospheric pressure anomalies, and between variations in cosmic ray flux and cloud nucleation processes in the lower atmosphere. The hypothesis in its most serious form, associated with researchers like Henrik Svensmark at the Danish National Space Institute, proposes that cosmic ray intensity, which is modulated by solar activity, influences the formation of low-level clouds, which in turn influences surface temperatures and precipitation patterns. The evidence for this connection, after decades of examination, remains inconclusive and contested. The mainstream atmospheric science community does not include solar variability as a significant driver of individual weather events at the timescales we're discussing here, meaning days and weeks rather than decades. The contribution of solar activity to the current storm is almost certainly negligible as a direct causal factor. But the question exists at the edges of the research literature, and on a week when the sun and the atmosphere are both acting up simultaneously and producing a visual spectacle over the same geography, it at least earns honest acknowledgement rather than reflexive dismissal. What is not speculative at all is the technological dimension of this geomagnetic event, and this is where the story becomes practically important rather than merely aesthetically interesting. G2 geomagnetic conditions can meaningfully affect the accuracy of GPS systems, not enough to make your navigation app useless, but potentially enough to matter for precision agricultural equipment, survey instruments, and certain aviation applications that depend on GPS accuracy within centimetres rather than metres. More significantly for this particular week, G2 conditions can produce measurable impacts on high-frequency radio communications, the kind used by aviation for long-distance coordination, and the kind used by certain emergency services operating in areas where cellular infrastructure is either absent or already compromised by storm damage. A blizzard takes down power lines. A tornado can disable cell towers. Emergency services falling back on high-frequency radio as a backup communication method are doing so precisely when that backup is operating under increased geomagnetic interference. That intersection is not a disaster in itself, but it is an additional layer of friction on systems that are already being pushed hard by the terrestrial event below. There is also the power grid consideration, which is worth naming plainly. Geomagnetic storms induce currents in long-distance transmission lines. The same physics that makes transformers work also makes them vulnerable to externally induced currents that they were not designed to handle. At G2 levels, this produces what engineers call geomagnetically induced current events, measurable but generally manageable perturbations in grid operation that utilities monitor and compensate for in real time. The risk of a significant grid impact at G2 is low, but grid operators across the northern tier of the United States are already managing a storm load, elevated electricity demand from the cold, potential transmission line damage from ice and wind, dispatch complications from weather-related infrastructure stress. Adding any additional variable to that management challenge, even a small one during the peak of a historic multi-hazard event, is the kind of compounding that emergency planners spend their careers trying to avoid and their nights trying to manage. So we have a historic blizzard, we have a tornado outbreak, we have fire weather in the south, we have a heat dome in the west, we have a geomagnetic storm decorating the blizzard with auroras while quietly nudging GPS systems and radio communications in directions that matter most when people need them most. Each of these things is explainable on its own terms. Each of them has a cause that science can point to with confidence. None of them required the others to exist, and yet here they all are on the same week, layered on top of each other with a timing that feels, and I choose this word carefully, almost editorial. As if something is making a point, as if the natural world has decided that this particular moment in this particular march deserves the full suite of everything it has available. There is something almost cosmically ironic about this week's alignment, a historic storm, an aurora shimmering above the snow, and arriving tomorrow as if the universe wanted to make absolutely sure you were paying attention and had not yet found a reason to look up, a rock from space, making its closest pass to Earth in years, right on schedule, right on cue, as if it had been invited. Part 10, the asteroid that arrives tomorrow. At 4.9 kilometers per second, a piece of rock roughly 25 feet across is currently travelling through the inner solar system and will make its closest approach to Earth on March 16, 2026 tomorrow. Its name is Asteroid 2026 ET2, and it poses zero threat to Earth. Let me be completely clear about that before anything else, because the combination of a historic storm and an asteroid in the same news cycle is exactly the kind of pairing that social media will handle irresponsibly if left unaddressed, and I would rather get ahead of that than clean it up afterward. The closest approach distance for 2026 ET2 is approximately 2.1 lunar distances, roughly 500,000 miles. In planetary defense terms, this is a comfortable margin. It does not require any tracking concern, any deflection consideration, any emergency briefing, or any action whatsoever beyond the routine logging that the Global Near-Earth Object Observation Network performs continuously, every night, regardless of what is happening in the atmosphere below. The people monitoring this object are not alarmed. They are doing their jobs, which on most nights look exactly like this, finding something, measuring it, confirming it is not coming for us, and moving on to the next one. But the timing is genuinely remarkable as a piece of cosmic coincidence, and there is legitimate scientific value in pausing on this moment before passing through it, because 2026 ET2 is not just a rock, it is a data point in a much larger story about how our civilization has chosen to watch the sky, and about what that watching has revealed. 2026 ET2 is one of 16 near-Earth objects passing within observational significance this week alone. 16. That number sounds alarming if you encounter it without context, so let me provide the context immediately. It is not alarming. The detection networks maintained by the Centre for Near-Earth Object Studies at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the European Space Agency's Planetary Defence Office, and dozens of ground-based observatories operating across multiple continents track hundreds of such objects every single month. The solar system is full of small rocks on orbits that periodically bring them into Earth's neighbourhood. Most of them are harmless, all of them are interesting. What makes this particular week feel different is not the objects themselves. It is purely the terrestrial backdrop against which these routine astronomical events are unfolding. A continent under siege from a historic storm, an aurora shimmering above a blizzard, and now a rock from the asteroid belt making a polite, uneventful 500,000-mile drive past the only planet in the solar system, currently generating 740 weather alerts simultaneously. The asteroid detection story is one of the genuine success stories of modern planetary science, and it deserves more recognition than it typically receives outside specialist circles. In the early 1990s, the global catalogue of confirmed near-Earth asteroids contained fewer than 300 objects. 300. Astronomers at that time understood intellectually that the solar system contained many more such objects, but the survey technology to find them systematically did not yet exist at meaningful scale. Today, the number of confirmed near-Earth asteroids exceeds 35,000, with new discoveries arriving at a rate that would have been genuinely unimaginable to the astronomers of previous generations. The survey programs responsible for this transformation, including the Catalina Sky Survey operating out of Arizona, the Panoramic Survey Telescope and Rapid Response System in Hawaii, the Atlas network of telescopes, and numerous other dedicated facilities, have fundamentally changed our understanding of the small body population in the inner solar system. They have also, critically, given us the warning time that planetary defense requires. You cannot deflect an asteroid you have not found. Finding them, years and decades in advance, is the first and most important step in the chain of planetary protection. 2026 ET2 falls into a category that planetary scientists describe with specific size thresholds, large enough to be detectable at reasonable range using current survey capabilities, but small enough that if it were to impact Earth, the damage would be regional rather than continental or global. The specific comparison that comes to mind, and that every asteroid communicator reaches for when discussing objects in this size range, is the Chelyabinsk event of February 15th, 2013. On that morning, a rock estimated at roughly 60 feet in diameter entered Earth's atmosphere over the southern Ural region of Russia at approximately 40,000 miles per hour and exploded as an airburst at an altitude of roughly 14 miles above the surface. The energy released was equivalent to approximately 30 times the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The fireball was briefly brighter than the sun. The shock wave, not the impact, because the object never reached the ground intact, but the pressure wave from the airburst shattered windows across 6 cities, damaged over 7,000 buildings, and injured approximately 1,600 people, the majority from flying glass. Over a remote and sparsely populated region, in the morning, when people were awake and near windows, the object was not detected in advance. It arrived without warning from a direction near the sun, in the one blind spot that ground-based telescopes cannot consistently cover. 2026 ET2 is smaller than Chelyabinsk, roughly 25 feet versus 60. A 25-foot object impacting Earth would produce a smaller airburst, likely with a smaller damage radius, though the specific outcome depends heavily on composition, entry angle, and velocity at the time of atmospheric entry. Arriving at 500,000 miles distance, it is a data point and a reminder that the Chelyabinsk-class objects, the ones large enough to hurt people but small enough to be difficult to detect far in advance, represent one of the genuinely incomplete chapters in the planetary defense catalogue. The major surveys have done extraordinary work on the larger objects, the ones with global consequence potential. The smaller, regional threat objects remain incompletely catalogued, and 2026 ET2 is a representative example of why that gap matters. The public fascination with celestial events coinciding with extreme terrestrial ones is not irrational, even when its expression tilts toward the irrational. Humans are pattern recognition machines, and we did not become pattern recognition machines by accident. We evolved in an environment where the ability to notice connections between phenomena, between the behavior of animals and the approach of predators, between the state of the sky and the likelihood of rain, between a sound in the dark and the presence of something dangerous, was directly linked to survival. The brain that looks for patterns and occasionally finds false ones is the same brain that occasionally finds real ones before it is too late. Natural selection does not optimize for epistemological precision. It optimizes for staying alive. So when the news contains a historic storm and an asteroid approach in the same week, the human brain reaches for connection, because reaching for connection is what human brains do. That reaching is not stupidity, it is hardware. What we do with it, whether we follow the reaching with evidence-based evaluation or with confirmation bias, is the part that is up to us. What 2026 ET2 actually offers, stripped of every layer of mystical interpretation and cosmic significance that social media will inevitably layer onto it between now and its closest approach tomorrow, is something more interesting than any of those interpretations. It offers a reminder, a specific, concrete, scientifically grounded reminder that the Earth is not a closed system operating in isolation. It is a planet, embedded in a solar system, orbiting a star that is currently running hotter than predicted in its solar cycle, moving through a galactic neighbourhood that is neither static nor empty. The storm over the United States right now is real, and it is caused by atmospheric physics and temperature contrasts and jet stream dynamics that we understand reasonably well. The asteroid passing tomorrow is real, and it is caused by orbital mechanics that we understand extremely well. The aurora shimmering above the blizzard is real, and it is caused by solar wind and magnetic field geometry that we understand well enough to forecast 48 hours in advance. None of these things required each other to happen. None of them are communicating. The universe is not sending a message. But the universe is, if you are paying attention, demonstrating something worth sitting with quietly before you fall asleep tonight. It is demonstrating that the systems governing this planet, atmospheric, solar, orbital, geological, are not background. They are not scenery. They are active, continuous, and occasionally simultaneous in ways that remind you, in a week like this one, that the stable and predictable surface of daily life rests on something considerably more dynamic than it usually appears. The rock will pass tomorrow without incident. The storm will evolve and eventually dissipate. The aurora will fade when the solar wind settles, and then the surveys will go back to scanning the sky. The weather models will go back to their next forecast cycle, and the sun will continue doing whatever it has decided to do with solar cycle 25, which, as it turns out, is considerably more than anyone predicted it would. Part 11. The solar cycle is getting strange. Every 11 years, on average, the sun goes through a cycle. It moves from a period of relative calm, few sunspots, minimal flare activity, quiet solar wind, the astronomical equivalent of a star taking a long, uneventful nap, to a period of maximum activity, with sunspot counts peaking, solar flares erupting across the surface, and coronal mass ejections launching billions of tons of magnetized plasma into space at millions of miles per hour. Then it quiets again, reaches another minimum, and starts over. 11 years. Cycle after cycle after cycle, going back through recorded human history and long before it. A rhythm as reliable as the tides and considerably larger in scale. We have been numbering these cycles since 1755, when astronomers first established a systematic record of sunspot observations. Solar Cycle 1 began that year. We are currently living through Solar Cycle 25. 270 years of recorded solar behavior, 25 complete cycles, a dataset that represents one of the longest continuous scientific observation records in human history. And Solar Cycle 25, which began in December 2019, at the previous solar minimum, has been doing something that this long record makes measurably, demonstrably unusual. It has been defying its own forecast in the most interesting possible direction. The predictions issued at the start of Cycle 25 by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Solar Cycle Prediction Panel, a group of solar physicists whose job is specifically to model and anticipate solar cycle behavior, projected a below-average peak, a quiet sun, a modest cycle, similar in strength to the historically weak Cycle 24 that preceded it. Nothing dramatic was expected. The models, drawing on multiple forecasting methodologies and the collective expertise of the field, pointed toward restraint. The Sun, apparently, did not receive the memo. Cycle 25 has been running substantially above the predicted level for much of its active phase. Sunspot counts have exceeded projections by margins that are scientifically significant rather than merely statistical noise. The frequency and intensity of significant solar flares, classified in categories from B through C, M, and X, with X-class being the most powerful, has outpaced what the models anticipated. Multiple X-class flares have occurred during this cycle at rates that were not predicted by the pre-cycle forecasts. Coronal mass ejections, the large plasma launches that produce the most significant geomagnetic effects at Earth, have been more frequent and in some cases more energetic than the quiet cycle scenario that was projected. The cycle appears to be heading toward a peak that could be among the stronger ones recorded in the past several decades, possibly comparable to Cycle 19 of the 1950s, which remains the strongest cycle in the instrumental record. The solar physics community has been processing this forecast failure with the combination of intellectual honesty and methodological scrutiny that good science requires. Papers have been published examining where the prediction models went wrong, what physical processes they underweighted, and what the implications are for future cycle forecasting. The short answer is that solar cycle prediction remains genuinely difficult, and the mechanisms driving cycle-to-cycle variability in solar activity are not yet fully understood. The Sun is a magnetic system of extraordinary complexity, and the dynamo processes operating in its interior that generate the 11-year cycle involve physics at scales and conditions that cannot be directly observed. We are, in a meaningful sense, still learning to read a star we have been watching for centuries. Why does any of this matter to the person who is not a solar physicist, who is simply trying to understand why this week feels like everything is happening at once? It matters because a more active sun has consequences that reach all the way down to the surface of the Earth and into the infrastructure of daily life. More geomagnetic events, more G3, G4 and G5 class storms on the NOAA scale, the kind that produce auroras over Florida, that interfere with satellite operations, that introduce significant induced currents into long-distance power transmission infrastructure. The G2 event currently coinciding with the historic storm is a relatively mild expression of what Cycle 25 has already demonstrated it can produce. The May 2024 geomagnetic storm, which reached G5, the maximum level on the scale, was the strongest event since the Halloween storms of 2003. It produced auroras visible from tropical latitudes. It caused orientation anomalies in low Earth orbit satellites. It temporarily degraded GPS accuracy in ways that affected agricultural equipment operating in the middle of planting season, and it passed without catastrophic infrastructure damage, which was fortunate but should not be mistaken for evidence that catastrophic infrastructure damage is not possible. The historical reference points are sobering. The 1989 Quebec geomagnetic storm, produced by a moderate solar event compared to what the Sun is capable of, took down the Hydro-Quebec power grid in 90 seconds. The entire province of Quebec lost power for 9 hours. Transformer damage from geomagnetically induced currents was detected across North America, with some components taking weeks to repair or replace. 6 million people lost power in March in Canada, conditions that carry genuine life safety implications at that time of year. The storm also disrupted satellite operations, forced changes to high-altitude flight paths, and produced auroras visible as far south as Texas and Cuba. And then there is the Carrington event. In September 1859, a solar flare and coronal mass ejection of unprecedented recorded intensity struck Earth's magnetic field with a force that remains unmatched in the instrumental record. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America failed simultaneously. Telegraph operators reported receiving electrical shocks from their equipment. Some telegraph lines continued transmitting messages after operators disconnected the battery power sources, running entirely on geomagnetically induced current from the storm. Auroras were reported at tropical latitudes, including observations from Cuba, Hawaii, and Colombia. The event lasted roughly 17 hours at its peak intensity. It was, by all evidence, the most powerful space weather event to affect Earth in recorded history. The estimated cost of a Carrington-scale event striking the modern electrical grid, based on analyses conducted by the National Academy of Sciences and Lloyd's of London, among others, runs into the tens of trillions of dollars globally, with recovery timelines measured in years rather than weeks, because the large custom transformers at the core of high-voltage transmission infrastructure are not stockpiled in warehouses. They are manufactured on order, one at a time, by a small number of specialised facilities worldwide. The current solar cycle peak is expected sometime in the mid-2020s, with the exact timing still under active scientific refinement. The unusual strength of the cycle means the window of elevated risk for significant geomagnetic events extends further into the future than the original modest predictions indicated. This is not a crisis requiring immediate personal action. It is a planning consideration that the relevant institutions, grid operators, satellite operators, aviation authorities, telecommunications companies, national emergency management agencies are actively working through with varying levels of urgency and varying levels of funding. The protocols for managing geomagnetic risk are better than they were in 1989. Monitoring systems are more sophisticated. Warning times have improved from essentially zero in the Carrington era to roughly 15 to 60 minutes for Earth-directed coronal mass ejections detected at the L1 gravitational balance point between Earth and the Sun. That is better. It is not enough for the largest conceivable events, and the grid's fundamental physical vulnerability to geomagnetically induced currents has not been eliminated. There is also the question, genuinely interesting, genuinely contested and genuinely worth naming without overstating, of whether solar activity variations have any detectable influence on Earth's climate and weather, at timescales shorter than the multi-decade cycles that climate science typically examines. The mainstream answer from atmospheric science is that solar variability explains only a small fraction of the warming trend observed over the past century, and that the current unusual solar cycle does not meaningfully alter the dominant direction of that trend. This is the robust, well-supported answer, and it should be the primary one. The more speculative question, whether elevated solar activity influences specific regional weather patterns through mechanisms like galactic cosmic ray modulation of cloud formation, or through stratospheric heating effects that propagate downward into the troposphere, remains at the frontier of the research literature rather than in its established core. If that signal exists, it is subtle. It does not explain the storm, but it earns a sentence. What is not subtle is the infrastructure exposure. What is not subtle is the fact that the civilization currently watching a historic storm tear across a continent while a G2 geomagnetic event nudges its GPS systems and radio communications. This civilization runs on satellites and timing signals and power grids in ways that the civilization of 1859 simply did not. The Carrington event of 1859 disrupted telegraphs. A Carrington-scale event today would have access to considerably more to disrupt. The sun is getting strange in a cycle that was supposed to be quiet. The storm below it is getting strange in a season that was supposed to be transitional. And the tools that humans are building to understand both of these things, the monitoring networks, the forecasting models, the early warning systems, are getting better faster than almost anyone predicted. Which raises the question of what those tools are about to show us next. Part 12. AI is rewriting weather forecasting. Sometime in the past 2 years, something crossed a threshold that meteorologists had debated for decades, and the forecasting community is still processing what it means. Not in the way that scientific communities process incremental advances, a new parameterization scheme, a modest improvement in model skill scores, a slightly better handle on convective initiation timing. This was different. This was the kind of threshold crossing that changes the assumptions underlying an entire field, the kind that makes experienced practitioners stop mid-sentence and reconsider frameworks they have held for their entire careers. Artificial intelligence models, trained on decades of atmospheric data rather than programmed with explicit physical equations, have begun producing weather forecasts that match or outperform the most sophisticated traditional numerical weather prediction systems in the world. And they do it in seconds instead of hours. That sentence contains two separate disruptions, and both of them matter enormously, so let me take them one at a time. The traditional approach to weather forecasting is an extraordinary intellectual and engineering achievement that most people interact with daily without having any idea what it actually involves. At its core, numerical weather prediction works by dividing the atmosphere into a three-dimensional grid of cells. Imagine the atmosphere carved into millions of boxes stacked from the surface to the stratosphere, each one representing a column of air over a patch of ground somewhere on Earth, and then solving the equations of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics for each cell simultaneously, accounting for the interactions between adjacent cells, at successive time steps moving forward from the current moment into the forecast period. The equations involved are the Navier-Stokes equations, some of the most computationally demanding mathematical expressions in applied science. Solving them at global scale and meaningful spatial resolution for a 10-day forecast window requires supercomputers operating at petaflop speeds, machines that consume megawatts of power, occupy entire buildings, and cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build and operate. The European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, based in Reading, England, runs one of the best such systems in the world. Its integrated forecasting system is the product of decades of scientific refinement, billions of dollars of cumulative investment, contributions from the best atmospheric scientists on the planet, and continuous improvement cycles that have been running since the centre opened in 1975. When meteorologists talk about the gold standard of global weather forecasting, they're almost always referring to the European model, often simply called the Euro. It has earned that reputation through 50 years of demonstrated performance. It is extraordinarily good at what it does. Google DeepMind's GraphCast, developed by the Artificial Intelligence Research Division of one of the world's leading technology companies and published in peer-reviewed form in the journal Science in late 2023, demonstrated in head-to-head comparisons that it could match or outperform the European model on the majority of standard meteorological forecast metrics across 10-day forecast horizons. Huawei's Pangu weather system produced similar results in parallel peer-reviewed work published around the same time. ForecastNet, developed at the NVIDIA Research Division, added further evidence to the same general finding. These are not marginal improvements at the edges of the performance distribution. These are systems matching or beating the Euro, the gold standard, across a broad range of standard verification metrics, and they generate their forecasts not on a petaflop supercomputer consuming megawatts of power, but on hardware comparable to what a well-equipped university research group might operate in under 60 seconds from initial conditions to completed 10-day global forecast. That is not an incremental improvement. That is a fundamental disruption of the resource constraints that have defined who can do serious weather forecasting for the past 50 years. When the cost of generating a competitive global weather forecast drops from hundreds of millions of dollars in supercomputing infrastructure to something achievable on commodity hardware in under a minute, the implications cascade outward in ways the field is still mapping. For multi-hazard events like the current storm, and this is where the connection between an abstract technological development and a very concrete human safety question becomes direct, the potential implications are significant in ways worth spelling out carefully. One of the persistent structural challenges in forecasting compound events that simultaneously generate blizzards and tornadoes and fire weather and extreme heat across different regions, is that traditional numerical weather prediction systems handle different hazard types through different specialized post-processing chains. The core model produces wind, temperature, moisture, and pressure fields. Extracting tornado probabilities from those fields requires a separate parameterization framework. Generating snowfall totals requires a different one. Fire weather indices require another. Storm surge estimates require yet another. Integrating all of these into a coherent, simultaneous probabilistic picture of a compound event has historically required meteorologists to manually synthesize outputs from multiple separate modelling pipelines, each with its own uncertainties and its own update cadence. The left hand of the forecast system does not always know what the right hand is doing. AI forecasting models are trained on the full suite of atmospheric observations simultaneously, without the compartmentalization that characterizes the traditional post-processing chain. When a machine learning model processes decades of atmospheric data, it learns correlations across all hazard types at once. The relationship between upper-level wind shear and tornado probability, between moisture flux and snowfall rates, between boundary layer mixing and fire weather potential, all within the same learned representation of atmospheric behavior. This means AI systems may be intrinsically better positioned to capture the co-occurrence probabilities that define compound events, to recognize from the atmospheric initial conditions that a setup is likely to produce blizzards in the north and tornadoes in the center and fire weather in the south simultaneously, rather than treating each of those hazard streams as independent forecast problems. The current limitations are real and worth naming with the same honesty that the capabilities deserve. AI forecasting models are, in technical terms, black boxes. They produce outputs, forecast fields, probability estimates, hazard guidance, without providing the mechanistic chain of reasoning that helps meteorologists understand why a particular storm is evolving the way it is. When a physics-based numerical model produces a forecast that subsequently verifies poorly, experienced meteorologists can often diagnose the failure. The model underestimated low-level moisture, or it mishandled the timing of an upper-level trough, or its convective parameterization triggered too early. These diagnostic capabilities are not just intellectually satisfying, they are operationally important because they allow forecasters to apply experience-based corrections to model guidance in real time. When an AI model gets a forecast wrong, it may get it wrong in a way that has no obvious physical interpretation. A smooth, confident-looking forecast that simply missed something in a manner that is difficult to characterize or anticipate. That is a different kind of uncertainty than the field is accustomed to managing. The training data dependency is also a genuine concern for exactly the category of events that matter most. AI models learn from historical examples. Their performance on situations that fall within the distribution of their training data can be excellent. Their performance on genuinely unprecedented events at the outer edges of what has ever been observed, events that represent new combinations of atmospheric conditions, is an open and actively researched question. The current storm, with its simultaneous multi-hazard complexity and its bomb cyclone forming over the continental interior, sits toward the unusual end of the historical distribution. Whether AI systems trained on historical data handle the unusual end of the distribution as reliably as physics-based systems, which derive their behavior from fundamental equations rather than historical patterns, remains to be fully established across a broader range of extreme events. But the speed is transformative in ways that the limitations do not diminish, and the accessibility is transformative in ways that the limitations do not diminish. The possibility of running not one forecast but hundreds of ensemble members, slightly different starting conditions producing slightly different atmospheric evolutions, all of them combined into a probabilistic picture of what might happen, in minutes rather than the hours that current ensemble systems require, opens capabilities that simply do not exist today at operational scale. High-resolution probabilistic guidance down to the street level rather than the forecast zone level. Faster detection of emerging severe weather signatures in the model output. More frequent forecast updates during rapidly evolving events, when the atmosphere is changing faster than the current model update cycle can track. The 30-minute average tornado warning lead time that National Weather Service data reflects is not a failure of effort or intention. It is a product of the physical constraints of current detection and forecasting systems, Doppler radar scanning cycles, warning issuance workflows, the fundamental difficulty of identifying rotation signatures in fast-moving squall lines before they produce a tornado. 13 minutes is enough time to save your life if you are awake, if your phone is on, if you know where to go, and if you're not in a mobile home. It is not enough time in a significant fraction of real-world scenarios. The technology that could expand that window, not to an hour, but perhaps to 20 minutes, perhaps to 30, perhaps to something that changes the survival calculus in ways that compound across thousands of warning events per year, exists in early form right now, in research environments, in proof-of-concept demonstrations, in peer-reviewed papers that forecasters and emergency managers are actively reading. The question is not whether these tools are coming. They are already here in prototype. The question is whether the institutions responsible for translating atmospheric science into public safety warnings can adapt their workflows, their validation standards, their communication systems, and their training programs quickly enough to deploy these capabilities where they matter, before the next compound event that looks like this one arrives and finds the warning system running on the same 30-minute clock it has been running on for 20 years. The atmosphere is not going to wait for the paperwork to clear. Part 13, the next generation of asteroid detection. The universe is considerably more crowded than it looks, and we're only now beginning to appreciate the full extent of the crowd. This is not a poetic observation. It is a measurable, quantifiable fact that becomes more precisely true with every passing year as our detection capabilities improve and the catalogue of known objects in the solar system expands. The night sky that humans have been watching for the entirety of recorded history, the same sky that inspired mythology and navigation and the first stirrings of scientific inquiry, contains vastly more objects than any previous generation of skywatchers could see, count, or track. We are not discovering new things so much as we are finally developing eyes capable of seeing what was always there. And what was always there turns out to be considerably more populated than the view from Earth's surface suggested. On a dark mountainside in the Atacama Desert of northern Chile, at an elevation of roughly 8,800 feet, where the atmosphere is thin and dry and the seeing conditions are among the best on the planet, a telescope is preparing to change that picture permanently. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory is not the largest telescope in the world by aperture. Its primary mirror measures 8.4 meters across, which places it in a competitive class but not at the absolute frontier of ground-based telescope size. What makes Rubin extraordinary is not its mirror, it is its camera. The Legacy Survey of Space and Time camera, mounted at the focal plane of the Rubin telescope, is the largest digital camera ever constructed for astronomical use. Its sensor array contains approximately 3 billion pixels, 3 billion individual light-detecting elements arranged across a focal plane roughly the size of a small car. To put that in terms that connect to something familiar, a typical modern smartphone camera contains somewhere between 12 and 50 megapixels. The Rubin camera contains 3,200 megapixels. A single image from this instrument captures a patch of sky, roughly 40 times the area of the full moon, in extraordinary detail, in multiple wavelength bands simultaneously, and the observatory is designed to take images like this continuously, every clear night, covering the entire visible southern sky every 3 nights, in a rolling survey that will run for 10 years. Every single object detected in those images, every star, every galaxy, every moving point of light that changes position between successive observations and therefore reveals itself as a solar system object, will be automatically identified, measured, and catalogued by a dedicated computing infrastructure processing data at a rate of approximately 20 terabytes per night. The algorithms doing this work will compare each new image against previous observations of the same patch of sky, flag any object that has moved or changed brightness, compute preliminary orbital parameters for newly detected solar system objects, and cross-reference the results against existing catalogues, all within hours of the observations being taken. Human astronomers will receive alerts about newly detected objects, potential close approaches, and unusual transient events in something close to real time. The system is designed to be not just a telescope, but a continuously operating automated discovery machine pointed at the solar system. The projected scientific output of this survey is genuinely staggering in ways that take a moment to absorb. Rubin is expected to catalogue approximately 20 billion individual astronomical objects over its 10-year operational lifetime. Within the solar system specifically, it is expected to discover millions of new objects, including the majority of near-Earth asteroids in the size range from roughly 30 feet to roughly 3,000 feet that have not yet been found and catalogued by existing surveys. This is the size range that matters most for regional to continental scale impact risk. Objects too small to threaten civilization, but large enough to devastate a city or a region if they arrived at the wrong coordinates. The Chelyabinsk object that injured over 1,000 people in Russia in 2013 was approximately 60 feet across. 2026 ET2, the asteroid we discussed in the previous section passing tomorrow at 500,000 miles, is approximately 25 feet across. Both of these objects sit in the size range where current survey completeness is limited. After a decade of Rubin operations, the catalogue of known objects in this size range will look dramatically more complete than it does today. The completeness question is worth understanding precisely because it shapes the risk picture in a specific way. When planetary scientists say that they have catalogued roughly 95% of near-Earth asteroids larger than 1 kilometre, objects capable of causing global catastrophic effects, they mean that the population of civilization-threatening objects is reasonably well mapped, and none of the known members are on collision courses with Earth in the foreseeable future. That is genuinely reassuring information. What it does not mean is that the smaller objects are similarly well mapped. They are not. The survey completeness drops significantly as you move down in size through the 100-metre, 30-metre and 10-metre ranges. Rubin will not achieve 100% completeness even in those ranges over its 10-year mission, but it will move the needle from a situation of substantial ignorance to one of meaningful awareness. We will know far more about what is out there than we do today. This improvement in knowledge will have a communication consequence that deserves as much planning attention as the detection technology itself. The number of announced near-Earth object close approaches will increase substantially once Rubin reaches full operational capability, simply because the number of known objects making those passes will increase substantially. Objects that currently pass undetected and unannounced will be detected, tracked, and added to the public close approach database maintained by the Jet Propulsion Laboratories Center for Near-Earth Object Studies. The database will grow. The frequency of close approach announcements will grow with it. And a significant fraction of the public, encountering headlines about newly detected asteroids passing at various distances from Earth, will not have the context to distinguish between a genuinely concerning object requiring attention and a routine cataloguing event requiring none. We are already seeing early versions of this communication challenge. 2026 ET2, passing at 2.1 lunar distances on a week, when a historic storm is dominating the news cycle, creates a specific category of public information problem: the temptation to connect unrelated events, to find meaning in coincidence, to allow genuine scientific information about a harmless flyby to be amplified and distorted by the ambient anxiety of an already alarming news week. That challenge, which is manageable at current detection rates, will become considerably more demanding as Rubin and the next generation of survey systems come fully online. The scientific community will need communication infrastructure, clear, accessible, consistently updated public information resources that is as sophisticated and well-funded as the telescopes themselves. The Double Asteroid Redirection Test mission provides the most important piece of context for understanding what improved detection actually enables. In September 2022, a NASA spacecraft the size of a vending machine travelling at approximately 14,000 miles per hour impacted the surface of Dimorphos, a small moonlet orbiting the asteroid Didymos, in the first deliberate test of kinetic impactor technology for planetary defence. The mission was watched by telescopes around the world and by the light Italian CubeSat for imaging of asteroid spacecraft travelling alongside the impactor. The results exceeded the most optimistic pre-mission predictions. The orbital period of Dimorphos around Didymos changed by 33 minutes, more than double the minimum threshold that mission planners had defined as success. A rock in space was hit by a spacecraft launched from Earth and moved onto a measurably different orbit. Planetary defense transitioned in a single experiment from theoretical concept to demonstrated capability. The lesson of DART is not that we can deflect any asteroid on any timeline with current technology. The lesson is that the physics works and that lead time is everything. A kinetic impactor needs years to decades of warning to achieve a meaningful deflection. The earlier the intervention, the smaller the nudge required to achieve a safe miss. An object detected with 10 years of warning requires a fraction of the energy to deflect compared to an object detected with 1 year. Rubin's contribution to planetary defense is therefore not primarily about finding objects that are already close. It is about finding objects early enough that the detection itself creates the options that make deflection feasible. The universe is showing us more of its contents every year, incrementally, and then, with Rubin's first light survey results potentially all at once. The question of whether our institutions and our public discourse are ready to receive that information clearly is not a rhetorical one. It has a concrete answer that depends on decisions being made right now about science communication funding, public education infrastructure, and the willingness of the astronomical community to invest in explaining what they find with the same rigour they bring to finding it. The crowd was always this large. We just lacked the eyes to see it. Now we are building them. And what those eyes are about to show us about the solar system, about the frequency of close approaches, about the population of objects sharing our neighbourhood, will require a public that is prepared to receive genuinely interesting information without confusing it for genuinely threatening information. That distinction, it turns out, is harder to maintain than it sounds, especially in a week when the sky's already doing everything else simultaneously. Part 14. Earth's climate system is entering a new phase. Something has shifted in the background state of the planet's climate system, and the shift is showing up in the data before the models fully predicted it would. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment before we move through it, because it contains something important that is easy to miss on first pass. The models, the sophisticated, extensively validated, continuously improved computational systems that climate scientists use to project how the Earth's climate will evolve under various forcing scenarios, are good. They are the product of decades of scientific work, enormous computational investment, and the collective expertise of thousands of researchers across dozens of countries, they have successfully predicted the general direction and approximate magnitude of global warming with remarkable consistency since the first serious climate projections were published in the 1970s and 1980s. When the models are being outpaced by observations, when the data is showing changes faster, and in some cases more extreme than the projections anticipated, that is not a reason to distrust the models. It is a reason to pay very close attention to what the observations are saying. The oceans are the clearest signal, and they are saying something that has genuinely surprised the scientific community in its speed and intensity. Marine heat waves, extended periods where sea surface temperatures run significantly above the historical average for a given location and season, defined technically as temperatures exceeding the 98th percentile of the historical record for at least 5 consecutive days, have been occurring with greater frequency, greater intensity, and across more geographic area than the historical baseline suggests should be typical for the current level of atmospheric warming. The North Atlantic Ocean in particular has produced several consecutive years of record-high surface temperatures, with anomalies so extreme during certain periods that they temporarily exceeded the upper boundary of the standard statistical distribution used to characterize normal variability, events described by oceanographers as essentially off the chart, outside the envelope, beyond the range of what the existing record defined as possible. This matters for the atmospheric story we have been telling all night, because the ocean is not separate from the atmosphere. It is the atmosphere's primary energy source, its moisture reservoir, and its long-term memory. The temperature of the ocean surface controls how much water vapor enters the atmosphere, how much latent heat is available to power storm systems, and how the large-scale circulation patterns that govern continental weather are organized. When the North Atlantic runs at record temperatures for years in succession, it alters the atmospheric circulation over Europe and eastern North America in ways that interact with storm tracks, blocking patterns, and the jet stream behavior we discussed earlier. When the Pacific cycles through unusual temperature configurations, it reshapes the ridge and trough pattern that currently has a heat dome baking the southwest and an Arctic intrusion plunging into the east simultaneously. The oceans are not passive victims of a warming atmosphere. They are active participants in determining what the atmosphere does next, operating on their own timescales that span months to decades. The Pacific has been cycling through temperature anomalies during this period that interact with the El Niño and La Niña patterns, the oscillating warm and cool phases of the tropical Pacific that represent the single most powerful source of year-to-year climate variability on Earth, in ways that current models do not fully capture. The transition from the significant El Niño of 2023 and 2024 into the subsequent conditions has produced atmospheric responses over North America that have contributed directly to the winter setup we described earlier. The anomalously warm western winter, the pre-energized atmospheric background state, the unusually sharp temperature contrasts arriving in March. The Pacific was writing this week's weather months ago, in water temperature anomalies that propagated into atmospheric circulation patterns that shaped the jet stream that is now producing the storm. The chain of causation runs long, and the ocean is near its beginning. Arctic sea ice extent continues its long-term decline, with summer minimums regularly approaching or setting record lows in a trend that has been unambiguous in the observational record since systematic satellite monitoring began in 1979. The September minimum sea ice extent, the annual low point reached at the end of the Arctic melt season, has declined by roughly 13% per decade over that period. The oldest, thickest multi-year ice that once dominated the central Arctic basin has been largely replaced by younger, thinner first-year ice that forms each winter and melts more readily the following summer. The Arctic is not just losing ice at the surface, it is losing the thermal mass and physical resilience that multi-year ice represented. The consequences of this loss extend well beyond the Arctic itself, and this is the connection that runs directly to the storm currently tearing across the United States. The Arctic Ocean, once insulated from the atmosphere by a persistent cap of sea ice through most of the year, is now open water for a significantly expanded fraction of the annual cycle. Open ocean water has a dramatically lower albedo than sea ice. It absorbs roughly 94% of incoming solar radiation, rather than reflecting most of it back to space as ice does. Every additional week that the Arctic Ocean spends as open water rather than ice-covered water is a week during which the Arctic is absorbing solar energy rather than reflecting it, adding heat to the high latitude system and accelerating the very warming that caused the ice loss in the first place. This is what climate scientists mean when they describe a positive feedback loop. The effect amplifies its own cause. The Arctic warming signal in the observational record is not subtle or ambiguous. It is robust, extensively replicated across independent measurement systems including satellites, weather balloons, ocean buoys, and surface stations, and it shows Arctic warming proceeding at roughly 3 to 4 times the global average rate. This is the physical foundation of the Arctic amplification hypothesis, and to be precise about the language, it is a hypothesis in the scientific sense of a well-supported explanatory framework, not in the colloquial sense of an uncertain guess. What researchers are increasingly discussing is not simply that the climate is warming in the sense of average temperatures rising, but that the system appears to be entering a phase of increased variance, a statistical stretching of the distribution of possible weather outcomes toward more extreme values at both ends. This distinction is subtle but important. A warming trend shifts the mean of the temperature distribution upward. More hot days, fewer cold days, higher average temperatures across the board. An increase in variance does something different and in some ways more disruptive. It stretches the tails of the distribution, making the most extreme outcomes more probable in both directions. More record highs, but also in certain regions and certain circulation regimes, more extreme cold intrusions as the jet stream becomes more variable and more prone to the large amplitude waves that drag Arctic air unusually far south. The paradox of historic blizzards occurring during a warming trend is not a contradiction of the warming signal. It may be a direct physical consequence of the mechanisms driving it. The current storm is a case study in what increased atmospheric variance looks like when it expresses itself at continental scale on a single day. The heat dome over the southwest is not simply warm for March. It is historically anomalous for its timing and intensity in a way that places it at the extreme end of the March temperature distribution for that region. The Arctic intrusion plunging into the east is not simply cold, it is anomalously cold relative to the seasonal average in a context where that seasonal average has itself been trending warmer, meaning the departure from expected conditions is even larger than the raw temperature numbers suggest. The contrast between these two air masses is not simply large, it sits at or beyond the extreme end of the observed distribution for mid-March temperature gradients across the continental interior. Every major component of this event is simultaneously pushing toward the edges of what the historical record defines as possible for this time of year. That is not random, that's a signature. Critical infrastructure across the United States was designed and built for the climate of the past, specifically for the statistical distribution of weather extremes observed roughly between the 1950s and the 1990s, the period during which most of the design standards governing power grids, bridges, stormwater drainage systems, building codes, and agricultural infrastructure were established and codified. Those standards encoded assumptions about what the worst-case events would look like, how frequently they would occur, and what combinations of stresses a given system might face simultaneously. A climate system with increased variance systematically violates those assumptions, not occasionally and randomly, but repeatedly, and in the same directions, toward more extreme heat, more extreme cold in vulnerable circulation regimes, more intense precipitation, more severe drought, more energetic storm systems arriving earlier and later in the season than historical patterns suggested they would. The costs of this mismatch accumulate in ways that compound over time and across systems. A power grid stressed beyond its design parameters during an extreme heat event the following summer may be operating with reduced redundancy when the next winter storm arrives. A drainage system overwhelmed by an intense rainfall event leaves saturated soils that contribute to flooding during the next storm 2 weeks later. A highway bridge designed for historical freeze-thaw cycles experiences accelerated degradation under the more variable temperature swings of a higher variance climate. These are not hypothetical future scenarios. They are documented patterns in the infrastructure failure record of the past decade, showing up in after-action reports and insurance actuarial tables and municipal maintenance budgets with increasing regularity. The question is not whether this shift is occurring. The observational evidence drawn from ocean temperature records, atmospheric reanalysis datasets, satellite observations, ground-based monitoring networks, and the insurance industry's own loss data is too consistent across too many independent sources operating through too many different measurement methodologies to be dismissed as artifact or coincidence. The question is, what the trajectory of this shift looks like over the next 20 years, and whether the human systems responsible for keeping people safe and economies functioning can adapt to a background atmospheric state that is genuinely without precedent in the period of recorded instrumental history. That adaptation is not impossible. It is not even, in most of its components, technically difficult. It is, however, urgent in a way that the storm currently spinning over the United States is making very difficult to ignore. Part 15. The real question. We have travelled a long way together tonight, from a weather map that should not exist to the depths of the solar cycle, from the mechanics of a bomb cyclone forming over the continental interior, to the capabilities of telescopes being assembled on a mountainside in Chile. We have talked about jet streams and polar vortices, about nighttime tornadoes and auroras shimmering above blizzards, about an asteroid making a polite 500,000-mile pass while the country below it generates 740 simultaneous weather alerts. We have covered a lot of sky. Let me now say the thing that all of this has been building toward. The thing that I think you already sense is coming, because you have been paying attention, and paying attention to this particular collection of events leads somewhere specific whether you want it to or not. None of the individual phenomena we have discussed tonight are unprecedented in isolation. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters when the subject is as consequential as this one. Bomb cyclones have happened before, over land, over ocean, in March, in other months. Jet stream amplification producing simultaneous heat ridges and Arctic troughs has happened before, in years that predate any serious climate change signal. Night tornado outbreaks have happened before, and some of them have been catastrophically deadly in ways that leave permanent marks on the communities that survived them. Solar cycles have peaked before, and some of those peaks were stronger than the current one. Near-Earth asteroids pass by Earth routinely, in numbers that the public would find surprising if the detection network made each one a headline, which it wisely does not. Warm winters have preceded violent springs throughout the entire length of the instrumental meteorological record going back to the mid-19th century. Each of these things, taken alone, would be notable. Each would merit careful attention from the relevant scientific community and reasonable awareness from the general public. None of them, individually, would justify describing this particular week as a fundamental turning point in the relationship between human civilization and the natural systems it depends on. The question is the simultaneity. The question that keeps surfacing, the one that serious scientists are asking carefully and that everyone else is asking loudly, is why all of these signals, the atmospheric, the solar, the planetary, the infrastructural, are arriving at the same moment, and why that moment feels like it carries a weight that the individual events do not. That feeling of weight is worth examining rather than dismissing, because it has two possible sources and they lead to very different conclusions. The first answer is coincidence. The atmosphere is a chaotic system of almost incomprehensible complexity, with an enormous intrinsic capacity for producing unusual configurations simply through the mathematics of nonlinear dynamics and large number statistics. Given a long enough observational record and a wide enough geographic scope, you will inevitably encounter weeks where multiple independent systems produce multiple independent extremes simultaneously. This week may be that kind of week, a statistical cluster of outliers that feels meaningful because the human brain is wired to find meaning in clusters, regardless of whether any causal connection exists between the clustered events. The aurora and the blizzard are not related to each other in any causal sense. The asteroid's orbital path was determined 4.5 billion years ago and has no physical connection to the jet stream configuration above Kansas. The solar cycle's unusual strength is driven by interior solar dynamics that operate on timescales and through mechanisms completely disconnected from the temperature of the Gulf of Mexico. Each of these things happen to land in the same news week. In a century from now, meteorologists and historians might look back at March 2026 as a remarkable anomaly, a week that stressed every system simultaneously and then passed, after which the atmosphere settled back into something more familiar, and the anomalous week became a data point in a long record rather than a harbinger of anything. Coincidences feel meaningful because meaning-seeking is what human minds do. It is, as we discussed in the context of asteroid flybys, hardware rather than insight. Not every pattern contains a message. The second answer is that this week is the early, still ambiguous expression of a system under accumulating stress, and that the simultaneity is not coincidence, but symptom. The atmosphere is responding to a background state that has been shifting for decades, and the shift is now large enough and fast enough that it is beginning to show up not just in long-term averages, but in the character of individual extreme events. Warmer oceans providing more energy to atmospheric systems, reduced Arctic sea ice accelerating high-latitude warming and destabilizing the jet stream's historically reliable behavior. More energetic spring transitions as the temperature contrast between anomalously warm western air masses and anomalously cold Arctic intrusions grow sharper rather than smaller. Under this interpretation, the temperature war between the western heat dome and the Arctic intrusion driving this week's storm is not a one-off event that happened to be unusually extreme. It is demonstration, one of many coming demonstrations, of what happens when the atmospheric contrast engine is fed inputs that sit at the far edges of the historical distribution. As the climate system continues along its current trajectory, those edge case inputs may become progressively less unusual. The maps that shocked experience forecasters this week, the ones that made people who have spent entire careers looking at weather data go quiet for a moment before they spoke, may eventually become something that future meteorologists recognize as a type, a category, a class of event with its own name, its own forecast playbook, its own emergency management protocols, because it will have happened often enough to warrant them. Both of these answers are honest. I want to be clear about that, because the temptation in a narrative like this one is to push toward the more dramatic interpretation and present it as established fact. The evidence does not currently force a choice between coincidence and symptom. The scientific literature contains genuine and substantive disagreement about how much of the observed increase in atmospheric variance is attributable to climate-driven changes in jet stream behaviour versus natural variability cycles that operate on multi-decadal timescales. That disagreement is not a sign of scientific failure, it is a sign of scientific integrity, of researchers following the evidence rather than the narrative. The atmosphere does not come labelled. It does not attach explanatory notes to its anomalies, it simply produces them and leaves the interpretation to us. What we do know, with confidence that does not require any particular position on the larger interpretive questions, is this. The storm spinning over the United States right now is real in every sense that matters. The 740 alerts are real. The blizzard burying the northern plains is real, the roads closed, the visibility gone, the snow accumulating against doors that people will struggle to open in the morning. The tornado threat unfolding after dark across the central corridor is real, and the people sleeping through the sirens in its path are real. The fire weather conditions in the south are real. The forecasters who have been awake for 20 hours running models and writing briefings and making the genuinely difficult decisions about how strongly to word public warnings are real, and the weight of those decisions is real. The question of how often events of this complexity and this simultaneity will occur, and whether the institutions responsible for protecting people from them are adequately prepared for a world in which they occur more frequently, that question is the most consequential atmospheric science question of the 21st century, and the answer is not being written in academic papers or government reports or international climate negotiations alone. It is being written in real time, storm by storm, alert by alert, data point by data point, in a sky that has been unusually active lately, and that is not by any current forecast finished with as yet. The map that should not exist is still active as you listen to this. It will have changed in its specifics by morning. Some of the hazards will have passed, the blizzard will have moved east, the tornado threat will have shifted, the fire weather watches will have been updated, others will have intensified or expanded into new areas. The atmosphere does not hold any single configuration permanently. It moves, it evolves. The enormous low-pressure system that has been the protagonist of this entire story will eventually fill and weaken and dissipate into the background flow, and the map will return to something that looks more like what forecasters expect to see in mid-March. That return to ordinary will feel, after a week like this one, like a genuine relief. But here is what I want you to carry with you when the storm passes and the map goes back to normal and the news cycle moves on to something else. If you pull up the satellite imagery loop from this week, the enormous counterclockwise spiral rotating over the heart of the continent, the fire weather burning in its southern periphery, the blizzard whiting out its northern quadrant, the aurora shimmering above the snow in colours that have no business appearing above a blizzard, the silent arc of a 25-foot rock completing its uneventful 500,000-mile pass, while all of this unfolds below it, what you will be looking at is not just a weather event. You will be looking at a portrait of a planet whose interconnected systems, atmospheric, oceanic, solar, orbital, are all in motion simultaneously, all expressing themselves at elevated intensity in the same window of time, all demanding attention from a civilization that has spent the better part of 2 centuries making decisions as though these systems were stable background rather than active foreground, a planet whose systems are speaking louder than they used to, whether that is because they have more to say, or because we have finally built the instruments sensitive enough to hear them properly, or both. That question may be the most important one we're not asking loudly enough. The real question was never about the storm. The real question is what we decide to do with everything the storm just told us, and whether we decide it before the next one arrives to repeat the lesson with even less patience for students who did not do the reading the first time.